Hello, everyone. My name is Valentina Rada. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of the Incarnate Word, and my dissertation research topic is a self-exploration of a project leader's career tilt, transformation, and motivational challenges in the face of a mass layoff. Before we go further into the discussion of this research, I would like to present the context of the problem. And I'd like to start with some statistics from the US Bureau of Labor. In the recent years, an average 1.5 million employees has been laid off in a month since 2015. The peak was in March of 2020 with 21 million layoffs. Most of these layoffs happened due to downsizing. There is research about communicating the bad news or how the layoff survivors balance their work versus life, but we don't know how many of these employees are left to stay with the companies after the downsizing and how do they adapt to the dramatically changing culture. Since this is a problem coming from the real world, I would like to add some personal context in my rationale for this research. I'm a certified project leader with a high working ethics and standards. I successfully led and continue to do so teams of developers that build solid product technology for various organizations in the United States. I'm compassionate and follow integrity, teamwork, and respect as ethical values. However, a couple of years ago, I witnessed a mass layoff due to downsizing at one of the organizations I worked for. Their experience was traumatizing enough to trigger my engagement in this research, to tell the story and let others relate and reflect on similar stories. In the case of this research, the central story is a mass layoff that took place before the age of COVID at a subsidiary office of a business corporation in the city of Blue Bonnet State. My story, approached in an autoethnographic manner, covers my experiences during the mass layoff day, as well as my recovery after being let go. The layoff triggered a personal and professional transformation, and the intent is to personal reflection to further analyze the phenomena of career development, engagement, and motivation in an organizational culture undergoing financial or structural crisis. So before I explain the process of this research, I would like to introduce the problem statement. This study addresses the lack of organizational strategies to create supportive work environments while downsizing. Also, how to support career growth at the professional level for the layoff survivors. And what are ways to improve leadership strategies for communication and engagement with the layoff survivors to the downsizing process? So for the first problem statement, as it relates to the lack of concern and support for employees' well-being resulting from the mass organizational layoff, we know from Bear and White, survivors perceive unfairness as most of the intense negative emotion. Considering Latman's perspective, when employees feel unfairly treated, they respond with low commitment and possibly increasing retaliation. Thus, this study discusses the challenges of creating supportive work environments through downsizing. Also, it relates to career growth opportunities at the professional level for the layoff survivors. This study discusses the limited career growth opportunity in downsized organization and how to keep layoff survivors motivated and optimistic about their future with the organization or other organizations. And it relates to the third problem statement. This research discusses the impact and influence of leadership behavior and strategies in the case of stressful work environments associated with organizations downsizing. Now, from an academic research gaps, there are three main gaps that the research is going to address. The first one is the lack of research on the topic of work values and behavior internalization. And in this context, the research discusses how attractive pay influences work values and behavior in organizational organizational crisis. The second research gap is a gap in time on the topic of career advancement and opportunities at the professional level in times of organizational crisis. And the main idea with the study is to explore the lack of support during between career mentoring and professional identification. I self-analyze in the context of this changing culture. And the third research gap is the lack of research on the topic of enhancing supportive leadership behavior to support commitment and motivation. And in this context, through self-reflection, this result contributes to an overview on motivation strategies to unleash performance and involvement in a cultural crisis. So really quick, the central phenomena is actually relates to my story of career transformation and motivational implications due to the mass layoff. And the research sub-questions, there are three research sub-questions. The first one is, what were the challenges I experienced due to the perceived lack of concern and support for my well-being during the organizational mass layoff that impacted my motivation and performance? And this first sub-question is meant to address answers for the first problem statement in the second research gap. The second research sub-question is, how did the limitation of career advancement resulting from downsizing process impacted my sense of confidence and performance? And the third research question is, how did the lack of effective leadership communication strategies impact my motivation and performance? I use a significant theoretical framework, and I have taken into consideration the below four motivational theories to support the purpose of this study. The first one is the self-determination theory, analyzing employees' performance, which is mainly affected by the type of motivation related to their job activities, but taking into consideration stability and trust. Is pay a sufficient extrinsic motivation? How is this related to performing autonomously in a changing culture? Then the second motivational theoretical lens is the self-efficacy theory. The self-efficacy is linked to increased involvement, but how to drive self-efficacy in a changing environment, especially if at a leadership level, there is not really an opportunity to build that self-efficacy. The third theoretical lens is goal-setting theory. Working towards a goal is considered a significant source of motivation about how to best align personal versus organizational goals. And then the last is path goal theory, how to adapt leadership style to support layoff survivors to stay engaged and motivation in their role without emotional distractions and related to their possible separation from the organization. This is the conceptual framework to reflect on my experience in trauma, starting with the day the mass layoff with the company I work for, but then continue until my layoff. This is not supposed to be, and it's not meant to be a chronological type of framework, but more so to underline and outline which are the theories and which instances I use each of them. I use a goal-setting theory lens to reflect on the performance review process with your disorienting goals and superficial feedback. I also use the the self-efficacy theory to reflect on my inability as a project leader to gain efficacy, and thus not being able to grow in my career with a company. Then I use the lens of self-determination theory to reflect on my abilities as a project leader to engage in project-related activities and prove performance and competence. In terms of the significance of the study, from a practitioner perspective, those who can benefit out of the study are, first of all, employers on how to create work environments focused on employees' emotional needs rather than processes and policies. Then, as it relates to employees, in terms of career growth, develop career planning and support strategies for professional growth at the employee level. And then related to the leadership strategies is how to engage those leadership strategies to review employees' performance and provide feedback in the case of a culture undergoing crisis. There is some significance of the study from a scholarly perspective. One relates to the work values and behavior internalizations after and within the mass layoff, career advancement at a professional level, and also adapting and enhancing certain leadership style in this times of crisis. Now, shifting gears a little bit, talking about my personal philosophical journey. So it first starts with my philosophical belief, the way I'm perceptioning reality as I address and analyze and self-reflect in the study starts with a relativist lenses, where reality is a result of my perception of the changing culture context, and knowledge was gathered by contextual circumstances. And then lending into my what counts as a knowledge and how I did introspect. I use actually introspection, exploring my career transformation as a project leader, and here gaining knowledge about this experience, using self-reflection to analyze the contextual organizational changes. And that, with the relativist point of view and introspection, that lend me to my philosophical view as it relates to this research as a constructivist, which means generating from my experience and patterns of from what others could learn from. And it's obviously pertaining to investigating an organizational phenomenon. And this paradigm led me to choosing qualitative methodology, which is describing the culture in an interpretative naturalistic approach to the world, and data collection was done through words, memory, and textual artifacts. Even going farther, the method I chose, just a little bit introduction here, is autoethnography, and wanted to make a parallel between autobiography and autoethnography. Slightly significant difference here. Autoethnography is more of a unique story of one's life as a self-portrait, is focused on oneself for purpose of representation, whereas autoethnography is placing the self within a social cultural context, in this case being an organizational culture. It's self-reflexive, it's vulnerable, and is a research method that uses storytelling and acknowledges and accommodates subjectivity. So the purpose statement, this study aims to explore my experience as a project leader and the impact of the mass layoff on my personal and professional transformation. The intent is to examine the self through autobiographical lenses and explore personal behavior related to the cultural environment as a technology development subculture in the case of the study. My position was closely examined from the inside to better analyze and critique the impact of the lack of supportive workplace, limited career growth opportunities, and poor leadership engagement on my personal and professional transformation. Really quick, an overview of the research and how I address each of the questions. As I was saying earlier, each of these questions are addressing certain problem areas from the problem statement and research gaps. And you can see here, I address them writing certain stories from my experience, such as My Career Tilt or The Curse of the High Pay, Steve is Not Here Anymore, or The New Office, to address the first research sub-question. And then as it relates, for instance, to how did the lack of effective leadership communication strategies impact my motivation and performance, I develop it through story like The Deadly Feedback or The La La Land, Here We Come, or again, my Career Tilt story. Talking even farther, the autoethnography I chose, it's the evocative ethnography, which is a genre of autoethnography that focuses on narrative presentation, then open up conversation and evoke emotional responses. It's more of a personal and cultural urgencies where autoethnographers compose story that combine social aspects of life and literature, and the stories that I told, they are into literary with a literary type of writing. And also evocative ethnography resists emotional distancing, which means that it resisted emotional distancing of the third person spectator voice of the traditional research by evoking feelings and connecting the reader to the audience. So it's more of a first person written. The participant observation and the setting. The time is before the age of COVID. The place is a city in the Bluebonnet State. It's a fast-moving consumer goods, and the subculture is a technology development culture. In terms of data collection, as autoethnography pertains to it, the self was the primary data source. It was evocative writing, self-reflection and introspection. I used my memory recollection, but I also had handy a couple of performance review forms, emails, and a few pictures and field notes, as well as recalled formal and informal communication. About memory recollection of the events, memory recollection needed to identify patterns of thoughts, talk, feelings, and action. In autoethnography, we must not worry only about the connection between the present in which we remember and the past of which we remember, but also the relationship of what we remember happening in the past and the stories we tell about what happened, how we retell and recount the past. So I use descriptive notes of my observations, dialogues, and the portrait of the participants, and that can be seen throughout the stories. Reflective notes of detailed personal thoughts and feelings of the experience and the events were considered. Also, we know that memory is interpretative, subjective, and open to various explanation. But I stay committed to evoking as far as I could remember, and I did remember most of the experiences. Storytelling and vignettes. It's autoethnography is more of a show rather than tell. It's a focus on dialogue, actions, and gestures. And from this point of view, the stories I related and I have used for my self-exploration or focus on traumatic tension and the character development related to this mass organizational layoff. I have introduced from the beginning, but even throughout my stories, the vulnerable self. Characters are complex, but not necessarily simple or good or bad. And I also use dialogue to advance not only character development, but situations. I got inside experience to write about it, and then review it from outside, re-experience and re-edit it to produce a good personal narrative. writing autoethnography, and in the case of this research, writing my stories and the vignettes was an ongoing process. Each story is purposefully written to capture the intensity of the events. Just because it's a self-exploration, I have determined that to use reflective bracketing. And although we know reflective bracketing is more a phenomenology type of instrument, I found it useful to leverage it in this context, especially when analyzing my stories and formulating the conclusions. I acknowledge that in this autoethnography, I was fully embedded in recalling my memories and telling the stories by accepting and acknowledging my values at the personal and professional level. And ever since I started from the beginning, I said, these are my professional values, but I'm also admitting and writing about it. I'm born and raised in an Eastern European culture. On the other hand, I balanced passion and discipline. I took subjectivity to the extreme and reflecting on others' similar experience to root meaning completely. Very importantly, I critically assessed and suspended any personal motives or values that would negatively impact the story characters or influence the research analysis and findings. This is a very sensitive topic, so I was very cautious of not actually pointing fingers or have any personal motives to denigrate my former employer or former supervisor. That's not the intent of this research. In terms of data management, without it in autoethnography, analyzing data is an ongoing event. Is a self-reflection. And as mentioned above, the main data sources of this research were my memories, personal journals, emails, and recalled informal and formal and informal communication. So as you can see, I started with data collection and then data management to it, but really important was the data analysis. And here I use Saldana's coding, starting with in vivo coding, and then I did verbal exchange coding, category coding, and ending with conceptual and theoretical coding. And you will see that and defining the main themes. So for in vivo coding, I performed that by capturing my story language, not to distort the trauma's emotional message. I use eyeballing technique to find repetitive and meaningful words or short phrases in my stories that align with the purpose of the theoretical framework and research questions. I use verbal exchange coding to capture the dialogue or any non-verbal cues in recalling the story. Similar to in vivo coding, I identify meaningful cues to support this research. And then related to the category coding, I analyze and synthesize my story data to determine more significant categories of ideas that emerge and align with a theoretical framework. According to Saldana's coding model, all categories and concepts, once identified, become systematically integrated around the central core category, the one that suggests a theoretical explanation of the phenomenon. And this is where it lends to the conceptual and theoretical coding. The process involved comparing and contrasting teams for their common conceptual connection, emphasizing organizational culture's impact on employees, on me as an employee, emotional well-being, involvement, and performance. So now in terms of making sense of the data, I just want to make sure, clarify that the intent is to infer practical and theoretical assertions. However, however, due to the minimal limited observational data, I look to infer assertion for practice in research rather than theoretical. So it's more of a sort of assertion, a practical assertion than a theoretical assertion due to the minimal observational data. Framework theory, the chosen theories, the 4 motivational theories I have listed earlier, guided my process of data organization, analysis, and interpretation in this structure of my writing. And also important, I connected my stories to the ongoing cultural, academic, and theoretical approach related to the human life. In terms of quality assurance, first, the statement of credibility, although storytelling about traumatizing experience can be rather therapeutical, as a researcher, I acknowledge my vulnerability by revealing the strong emotions I felt throughout the layoff crisis. My self-reflection was intentional and will help employees and employer better understand and empathize with the crisis impact on one performance and involvement. Now, talking about a verisimilitude, which is the factor reality, and pertains to the research method that I chose, the evocative autoethnography. The intent is to bring the reader to a reality that is not only emotional, impactful, but which capture the dialogue and intensity of how the layoff was perceived from different angles. The intent is to connect the readers to writers and provide continuity of their lives. Related to the bias, my bias as a researcher is obviously hard to avoid as a storyteller and participant observer. However, Herman states that autoethnography is one of the few places in scholarship where researcher voice is explicitly allowed. Additionally, I acknowledge my lenses as a passionate alcoholic born and raised in an Eastern European culture with a graduate education in the United States. My biases are thus anchored in my past, recognizing and acknowledging them in the ways the stories were recollected and reflected upon. In terms of my autoethnography sense, the reason I chose autoethnography as the research method is that I believe this approach will allow the readers to be inspired by my reflection on the experience to the mass layout. My hope is also that others who have been through similar experiences would rather shift their mindset from victim to survivor and focus on their career improvement rather than the resentment towards their former employers. Now, there are a couple of limitations identified for this research, and the first one is the self as a participant observer, and then obviously related to that is the dual role of the storyteller and researcher. Being the storyteller and researcher at the same time added complexity to the research process in the sense of writing and reflecting with a different mindset. So writing as a storyteller and a participant observer, and then shifting mindset as a researcher in analyzing the entire data and using theoretical lenses. As a researcher, I deep dive into the memory recollection to impart the intensity of my perception of the prolonged layoff experience. As a researcher, I detach from the emotional side of the story and conceptually coding and categorizing the meanings and findings while aligning to the research questions as well as theoretical. Discussing the ethical consideration of this research, first one is the procedural ethics. Even though there are no study participants, I obtained university's approval for this research by submitting a comprehensive details of this proposal for the IRB approval. In terms of confidentiality, one other ethical concern to mitigate through this research was disclosing sensitive information. From this perspective, I ensured that no data or information internal to the company was provided. I used pseudonyms for characters to not generate any harm for those mentioned or for the company referred in the study. In terms of credibility, starting with its purpose in the entire research process of storytelling, analyzing and reporting of the findings were probed with honesty and trustworthiness. As it relates to the contribution, my intent with this research and its outline is to contribute to the body of knowledge about layoffs and their impact on employees' well-being, motivation, and productivity. In terms of research practices, the intent is contribute to how autoethnography as a research method can be approached in terms of telling and engaging into outlining the reflection emotions, but also how data management can be performed in autoethnography using coding and connections with literature and theory. As it relates to possible risks, the company or main characters could be identified. However, the company no longer exists as a group entity. It has been dissolved. Managers and leadership could be recognized, but again, this was mitigating by using pseudonyms. Another risk is relates to vulnerability, exposing myself of losing my job at one point, accepting the fact and acknowledging that others may judge my experience. The intent in this sense is for others to relate to the stories. Another risk is the emotional introspection, going back in the past and opening memories that I forced myself to forget back when I was on the layoff happened. I did indeed encounter sadness and mild depression, but I kept communicating with others and differentiating between facts and emotions. And another one is the memory recollection. And in this one, I continue to write and deep dive into how I felt and rephrase and rewrite the stories where necessary. Now, considering the study research questions, theoretical and conceptual frameworks, and the extensive research on the topic of on the layoff phenomena and motivational leadership strategies, I have identified six conceptual themes to support the purpose of this research. There are three main abstracts that stood out. It's motivation and performance, one of them, career growth, and personal transformation. And now I will start elaborating on each of these conceptual themes. The first one is my well-being challenges as a layoff survivor. This theme is meant to answer the second research sub-question of what were the challenges I experienced due to the perceived lack of concern and support for my well-being during the organizational mass layoff that impacted my motivation and performance. At the same time, this theme addresses the first problem statement, and to support my reflection, I have chosen the lenses of self-determination theory. So, according to self-determination theory, other than needing autonomy, people look for ways to attain competence and build connections and relationships with others, which is called relentlessness. Each of these needs is important for unleashing motivation. Ryan and Deci, who are the self-determination theory pioneers, state that motivated employees do their best at their job, even if that involves competence, especially when autonomy and relentlessness with others are present. However, in the case of this organizational crisis, my relentlessness was significantly impacted, and thus my sense of belongingness diminished. This is being one of the reasons for my low involvement and detachment. Moreover, if highlighted in here, the emotions I encounter after the mass layoff were a blend of fear, anger, guilt, and loneliness. Additionally, I experienced signs of burnout and grief. With every day passing, combined with a lack of communications, these emotions intensified, impacted my productivity and well-being. And going back to the self-determination theory, Latman in 2012 states that impactful events have emotional consequences, not only when one's well-being, but it also influencing their behavior. Implicitly, emotional distress affects one productivities and emotion. Thus, the toxic emotions I experience and my perception of lack of well-being support trigger detachment and lower involvement in one of the areas. The perceived lack of well-being supporting intrinsic motivation, where the stress and overall burnout negatively impacted my performance and productivity. The second theme is identified as ineffective communication strategies impacted my sense of safeness, commitment, and productivity. This theme answers to the research question of how did the lack of effective leadership communication strategies impact my motivation and performance, and addresses the third problem statement. To support my reflection on this theme, I have chosen the lenses of path-goal leadership theory. So before the mass layoff, I trusted the leadership and how they communicated with us. There were town halls, birthday parties, family, and the culture in general was family oriented. However, right after the mass layoff, the new leadership tried a town hall, but the message didn't sound honest or trustworthy. The leadership right after the mass layoff and the managers didn't have a clear plan to communicate with the layoff survivors or how to keep them motivated and engaged. One of my statements was they feared losing us sooner than needed. According to House and Mitchell, the pioneers of path-goal leadership theory, subordinates' performance is impacted by the leader's behavior when the leader's behaviors is also related to subordinates' expectations that their effort will result in desired rewards. So House and Mitchell outline in this sense to support subordinates' motivation for leadership engagement strategies. Recognizing subordinates' needs, providing coaching, helping subordinates clarify expectations, and reducing frustrating barriers. Now, going back to my experience, one of my biggest fears was losing my job. After this experience, it would have helped to support my motivation if my supervisors were trying to recognize this need for safety and stability and acted towards it. So in this sense, the leadership behavior kind of lack of recognizing my needs as a subordinate, which was the need of safeness. In terms of providing coaching, the lack of coaching and direction to support the team of the assigned goals and work was another aspect that impacted my performance. I felt abandoned and had to find ways to perform independently. Since the goal was to shift effort and resources to the main office or outsource, my supervisor had located my minimal effort to guide or mentor me. In terms of helping me as a subordinate clarify expectations due to the lack of experience, and this is another side of the reflection, because of the lack of the experience, I did not ask for help when needed. I have not stepped out to clarify my needs and expectations. The lack of structure in the accounting work and my involvement generated frustration and impacted my productivity. And then the last area, reducing frustrating barriers for the subordinates. Due to the lack of open communication, my supervisors were not always aware of my fears or obstacles I faced in performing, and thus to support to offer the support of removing frustrating barrier. My frustration increased and impacted my productivity due to the lack of open communication. So with all these aspects, I am kind of outlining the ineffective communication strategies, the perceived ineffective communication strategies of the leadership after the mass layoff. The third theme I have identified is my work values and attractive pay and behavior internalization in times of cultural crisis. This theme answers the research question of what were the challenges I experienced with the perceived lack of concern and support for my well-being, but addresses the first research gap on the topic of work values and behavior internalization in a dramatically changing culture. To support my reflection for this theme, I have chosen the lenses of self-determination theory. So going back to this theory, when discussing the impact of extrinsic rewards on motivation and performance in the context of competitive need, Ditchy and Ryan stated for many individuals, work not only represents a source of income, for survival, it is also a form of self-realization and personal satisfaction. People search for careers that have meaning and that provide not only money, but also a sense of purpose and fulfillment. In this sense, going back to the before the mass layoff, my work values were integrity, teamwork, and respect for others. I was productive and a high performer because I enjoyed my work. However, I struggled to stay committed to my work values due to the negative emotions that impacted my behavior. And in this sense, employers should acknowledge that mindset shift, even to the most committed and devoted employees. Additionally, although at the time my pay was high, that was not enough to overcome the tension and the uncertainty of losing my job. Going further, discouraging leadership behavior influencing my motivation and performance. This theme addresses the research question of how did the lack of effective leadership communication strategy impacting my motivation and performance. To reflect on this theme, I chose the lenses of goal-setting theory. So goal-setting theory and discussing goal-setting theory focuses on the importance of goal specificity, opportunity, and feedback that increase work motivation. Goal setting isn't only related to the individual, but to the organizational level. Thus, leadership sets performance targets for strategic organizational value. Those objectives are or should be cascading from the divisional objectives down to the individual. However, in the context of this research, my reflection went through the performance review process after the mass layoff. When the mass layoff started, the company already had a performance review process. Although the intent of this review was to have employees work against company goals, how the process was executed was unclear for most employees, especially for myself. And in my case, it had a detrimental impact on my motivation due to one, the lack of clarity, the inconsistency and ambiguity of the performance review process, especially. There was also lack of commitment, missing challenge, but the most important was the poor feedback. My supervisor's hesitation and discussing the unfavorable performance generated a lot of confusion. The performance review process and the feedback, the way it was provided, only intensified my lack of trust. I remember feeling so lonely during the 8 hours a day I spent at work. I felt trapped, smothered, and tired. But issues, new requests, and projects kept coming. My spirit was low, and this is a capture of describing my feelings in one of the stories that's called The Transformation on Set. Okay. The next theme is career growth and limitation in times of downsizing. And this theme answers the research question of how did the limitation of career advancement resulting from the downsizing process impacted my sense of confidence and performance. And to support this reflection, I have chosen the lenses of self-efficacy. Bandura in self-efficacy theory considers that expectation of personal efficacy come from four sources. One is performance accomplishments or performer mastery, which refers to how strongly efficacies develop after repeated success while reducing the negative impact on occasional failure. The vicarious experience or role modeling is when one becomes more confident when seeing someone accomplishing a goal. The third one is verbal persuasion, increases confidence when we are told that we have the skills to succeed. And the last one is the emotional arousal. And the emotional arousal and is when we perform better because we are emotionally excited about working on a task. So now going back to my experience before the mass layoffs, I was optimistic about my future with the company. That optimism kept me motivated and productive. I was looking to step into a leadership role, and I saw the possibility of growth. However, lack of opportunities to gain leadership skills and the impact on my career growth, it has a negative impact on my career growth. Due to the mass layoffs, I shifted my mindset into a survival mode rather than a growth mode. Confusion was a common denominator of my professional failure. So, discussing this, can you stop discussing this with the lenses of self-efficacy? So in terms of performance mastery, due to downsizing, my role became more tactical. I felt a lack of role models to increase my confidence in being a leader. There was a lack of encouragement and fear of losing my job. This discusses the verbal persuasion. And also, as it relates to the emotional arousal, there was a fear and anxiety that took over my excitement of possible promotion. This is the last theme is the mass layoff impact on my career till then personal transformation. This addresses actually the central question of the research, discussing how actually all this experience had an impact on my professional and personal transformation. So right after the mass layoff, I started investing time and money in my education as a diverting coping way with the stress and anxiety of losing my job. In this sense, I returned to school, which actually helped me deal with my emotions, occasionally increasing my confidence and supporting my chance to be employable. After the mass layoff, I focused my energy and drive on my education, career, financial improvement, and wellness. And I discovered and I continued my education. I became a certified project manager. I engaged into this PhD program. My career, although at first it stagnated, then it grew. I learned from a financial improvement perspective. I learned to bargain for houses, to save money. And then in terms of wellness, I focused my energy on exercising and identifying a routine that helped me physically and mentally recover from this job loss. Overall, I overcame this crisis and grew out of it. I learned from the way I handled the situation and applied those learnings to my next jobs. My transformation was the most dramatic one in a positive way due to my focus on what I could have done better and what was in my control to change. I learned to focus on my growth rather than blaming on the professional failure of my former employer. Now, if we are to conclude and to kind of draw some conclusion, if so what or who cares, some of these layoff implications for organizations and employees. First of all, through this reflection, what I learned, not only through the reflection, but through the research I read and through the theoretical lenses I chose, I learned that organization would help if they develop strategies to overcome emotional distress and lack of engagement in terms of downsizing. Then when we talk about the layoff for survivors, the employees that stay with a company after the layoff happens, to establish career goals to support professional growth, to overcome this career stagnation due to downsizing. And then when we talk about layoff victims, shift to a learning mindset and focus on career improvement rather than their resettlement towards their former employer. So now what? We was talking earlier, organizational strategies and time downsizing. And this starts being discussing in certain organizations, have a downsizing plan and process in place, acknowledge that competitive pay does not support productivity. Establish organizational goals considering the organizational uncertainties to achieve those goals. Support employees with relevant feedback regardless of the company's uncertainty. And here comes to, yes, the company is downsizing, but be relevant with the feedback and not necessarily to the organizational financial crisis. Support layoff survivors who are being how? Efficient ways to handle employees' emotions, provide coaching and direction, and recognize and support employees' job security need. Organizations should acknowledge that employees are not fixed assets, they are human beings with emotions and personal values. Now, overcoming the trauma of the layoffs, talking about the layoff survivors versus the layoff victims. Those survivors, you're still in the company. Career growth can still happen after mass layoff. If we find a mentor, we have a plan. Stay open and ask questions about companies' futures. Establish goals considering the organizational uncertainties. Again, these ideas are from my personal reflection, but also from our research, extensive research on the phenomenon of layoffs. And when we talk about the layoff victims, the people that are let go through the mass layoff, continue setting goals for career growth, invest time and effort in education, wellness, or others. Be emotionally prepared to overcome the separation with the former employer. Conclusions. I would like to reflect, especially towards the research method I chose. Autoethnography is a profound research method. Although at first it sounds easy and rather therapeutic, it instead brings up a discussion topics untold from an emotional perspective. We are using the corporate world or even academia to talk and discuss product, process, tools. However, we seldom focus on the people, their feelings, and even their emotional needs. This is the beauty of autoethnography. It brings to life untold personal experiences in different contexts in a narrative voice. In my case, it's an organizational dynamic changing culture and its impact on my well-being. And with this, I'm going to pause here. Thanks for your attention.